Hello, thank you very much. My name is Leonardo Raznovich. I'm a visiting senior research fellow at the Intersectional Center for Inclusion and Social Justice at Canterbury Christ Church University in the United Kingdom. I'm currently conducting a research, social legal research in the Caribbean about the impact of sodomy laws in the region. And as part of today's presentation, I thought I should give a little background. And interesting, when I was thinking about the background, I didn't realize how relevant it would be for the conference we are attending. It's a shame that we are not having the whole conference listening to each other, because I learned a lot over the last few days about what is going on. And it would have basically contributed with all the people from other parts of the world to an interesting debate, aspects of what I learned and what I'm going to share today. There was a few concepts that I was able to catch from the last couple of days at the conference. One was this idea of the need to not exist in existence as a way of protecting oneself. The first day, this interesting presentation at the end of the universe of non-existence was it was a sarcastic presentation, but it is in different presentations I heard throughout the conference there, this idea of the universe that protects us and makes us not exist, in order to prevent, because if we exist, then we have to, we suffer. And this is the other concept. The powerful tends to oppress us, tend to attack us, and then by non-existing, then we prevent that from happening. But then the full circle comes to a close when we hear that in Chechnya, even though we tend not to exist and to live a life in the closet, we are still being attacked in even a more viciously way, because if we don't exist, then in theory we cannot be murdered. And hence, when we are murdered, since we never existed, then nobody can complain about us, right? So the full circle comes, and today's presentation somehow trying to show some rationale into these concepts. And so, any button or just? There you go. So I share with you these three pictures, which have been informing my research for the last few years. And I guess the different contexts, but they all share in common one aspect, a few aspects, but the aspects that are relevant here. The perpetrators of these atrocities are all white men, and the victims in these atrocities are a group of people that have been actually labeled as somehow enemies of those societies for different reasons, and the one relevant to us, perhaps, is the one here at the bottom right, which is an actual portrait of the way in which the conquerors that came from Spain dealt with sexual minorities, native sexual minorities in the Americas when they first put a foot. This is not only portrayed in this actual contemporary painting, but it's also in the chronics written by those who came with the conquerors. So the historical evidence is there of the way in which they dealt with them. Now, in fairness, the reason why the conquerors did that was to inflict fear in the natives. And they literally used for them was the most disgusting group, the queers of the community, to inflict fear in order to gain information. The conquerors wanted the goal. That's what they wanted. They didn't want to discipline the community in terms of the sexuality itself, the goal there. But regardless of that particular aspect, what we can see here is the targeting of a group in the community, right, for a particular economic or social goal. If we look at the top one, that is not a contemporary painting, but it is actually portraying the burning of Jews in Strasbourg during the Black Death in Europe. The communities were blaming Jews of having caused the Black Death. Now, there is a historical fact for this, which explained there is no statistics, of course, but the rumors or the social rumors of the time that the Jewish community survived at in higher rates the Black Death by comparison to other social groups has been dealt by anthropologists and academics working in the field and explained to a certain degree by certain practices. I mean, so those who are familiar with Judaism, myself being half Jew, not practicing, but understanding of the certain aspect of the religion practices, one knows that every day, twice a day, one has to actually pray, and before touching the Bible, it is important to wash your hands. And that in a context where the Black Death was caused by filthy and dirtiness is likely to have impact in the contamination that was bringing into societies which did not have cleansing practices because of the lack of resources, if you want. But without justifying that, what is clear is that what we have there is that a social need, not necessarily a vertical as it is here, that is actually an horizontal social need of finding someone guilty, right, for the horrible things, the Black Death, that were occurring in the community. So that is a social approach. So whether it comes from a powerful, from the powerful in a vertical way, or whether it is a social, horizontal issue, as human beings, we tend to try to find someone whom to blame, or simply just as a scapegoat, right? To actually diverse the attention in a particular time, in a particular community. And so this practice, which is not something that necessarily developed at these times in the Middle Ages, we can see it what the Romans will basically define as the hostis, right? Which is the creation of an enemy, right? You declare someone an enemy. Even if you go backward to the Greeks' time, the ostracism was a more civilized way of dealing with that, in which someone was actually forced to leave the community. But the Romans, no. The Romans will actually create someone as an enemy. It could be a foreigner, in circumstances where it was a foreigner. We're talking of the hostis alienigena, alien. The word alien comes from there, from that root. If it was someone internal, it was a declaration, particularly if he was a Roman citizen, a declaration of what is called hostis judicatus, basically the declaration of someone as iutis, which implication was that that person was stripped of its Roman citizenship, not having more the protection of the ius civilis, which was the law of the Roman citizen, and therefore all its assets and even life could be disposed by losing that status. Once someone is an enemy, then it doesn't require much study to know that then one doesn't have any more sympathy for that. And in modern times, we have the same social practices. I mean, we see it on a daily basis with immigrants. We see it in daily basis with social minorities in many societies. And at the more vertical stage, I mean, examples of modern times have been basically during the Second World War, the Nazis declaring the Jews enemies of the state, and more recently, the enemies combatant. Right? Still, we have people arrested in Guantanamo Bay without facing trial, which basically are suffering the same. A state, the power of a state, using this concept to declare them enemies and then disposing or using them as they wish. And so how this relates to what I am working on now, right? And briefly, basically, we need to go back in terms of how homophobia has been construed over the last 2,000 years. It has not been just one declaration at one single point. There is a history behind that. And it has to do with the control of sexuality. Of course, sexuality was always an aspect of debate in negative and positive ways. If we look at ancient Greece, the Stoics as a school will have very interesting debates about, and very negative to a certain extent. But those were normal discussions amongst different philosophical schools. What would happen, or where we can clearly see a mark that will actually start a difference, is with the growing of Christianity from a pagan religion into a more mainstream religion of the Roman Empire. And once Christianity was a pagan religion, they tried to differentiate, more following the Stoicism as a school of philosophy that will actually fit into Christianity, with very negative views of sexuality. And we have one of the first theologians in Christianity, Clement of Alexandria, someone who actually has been demonized with the Roman Catholic Church, but then has been actually restituted as a great philosopher later in the middle of the second millennium. Clement's idea of sexuality basically is going to inform the growing of Christianity already in the 2nd century CE. And his conception was sexuality purpose is only procreation, and everything, and this is going to be familiar in all discourses, anything that doesn't lead to procreation is of course against nature, and therefore it is heresy. Now, as Christianity became the Roman religion, and this is happening in the 4th century with Constantine becoming the emperor, these concepts are going to become the important concepts in terms of the control of sexuality. But it was not only the control of sexuality that was important for the Roman Empire. It was also the control of the other pagan religions, which were opposing Christian values. So we will see historically during those first 500 years of the first millennium that the fighting of different types of sexualities, along with the fighting of pagan religions, will be almost on a hands-to-hands basis. The first laws that we can trace that actually criminalize certain sexual practices come from the 4th century. Laws basically were referred to as the first 3 words of the digest, and Lex cum vir is the law from 342 that actually declare illegal sex with males. At that point, still Christianity has not been adopted, and the reasoning for this law, legal historians will say, had to do more with a prohibition on Roman citizens to adopt passive positions with other men. This has to do with a matter of a status, not necessarily with an issue of sexual intercourse between 2 male persons. But this law will become important because after Rome falls, and when in the eastern part we have Justinian as emperor, who codifies all the laws, and this is an important mark again, he's going to take that law and going to make it much harder, and is going to start a witch hunting of homosexual in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. from the 6th century onwards. And the chronics are very clear, indicating that it was a rather atrocious witch hunting of homosexuals throughout the empire, particularly during Justinian times. Western Europe was not necessarily affected by this because Rome has fallen, and we have basically diverged into our own tribes in Europe. We are at the very, very dark ages of the Middle Ages here. Now, okay, this is what is going to unfold the making of homophobia during the first half of the second millennium. Because what we have is Christianity consolidating power. We're going to see a revival of the Justinian Code that was operative in the eastern part of the empire. And then the revival of those Romans' idea of enemies. So we have external enemies, the war, the crusades against Islam, but we also have internal enemies. We have the Jews as internal enemies in Europe. We have the lepers. The lepers were considered demoniac people, and they were burned for being lepers. And we have also the homosexuals to a certain degree, because the church did not have. We have interesting historical accounts. For instance, we look at France, 11th century, where the Pope of the time was actually written by bishops saying that the appointment of certain bishops which were clearly homosexual is not desirable, and nevertheless the Pope appointed them as bishops. So the church was not necessarily in the western part following the Eastern Justinian approach, but the church did have a problem. And the problem the church had then, as they have today, is the one of pedophilia within the walls of the church. So in the 11th century, the Pope of that time ordered an interesting research, which was asked to be conducted by a father, his name was Damiano, in the 11th century, about the problem of pedophilia within the church. And he came with a rather striking report, and the nefandum sin, the sin that cannot be named, grew there. That's the first time we have the use of the word sodomite to refer. Why the word? Because it cannot be named. There were Latin words. Cevio, futuo, are oral intercourse, anal intercourse. They were active verbs, right? If you think about at least Latin root languages, and I think with English, we now use passive forms of active verbs to refer or to use to describe those. But in Latin, there were active verbs that meant active forms of anal penetration or oral penetration. Those words will disappear. But why didn't they use? Because it cannot be named, right? It's a sin that cannot be named. I mean, because it cannot be named, then we're going to refer to it by naming, well, a biblical description, Sodoma, and hence sodomite. In other languages, German, for instance, medieval German will use Florenzen, because that was a practice that was actually happening somewhere else, but not in Germany. Chechnya idea that they don't have homosexuals. It was the same, right? And the French and the English will use the word bougre or bagar for reference to Bulgari. That's something that happened there, not in France or in Britain or in England at that time, right? So the idea that there's something foreign, alien, it facilitates then what is going to become the witch hunting, because if they're alien to us, then we can destroy them. If they're enemies of us and they're alien, then they're not part of us, then we can actually deal with them. Just wanted to basically, let me just say something more here. Basically, this is what is going to inform, to a certain degree, the English sodomy laws. I'm just jumping here. I'm just jumping because I'm running out of time. The sodomy laws were first brought in England by Henry VIII in the 16th century. Before that, there was social stigmatization. You can find laws from the 12th century, which there's no record of ever being enforced. But in any way, they didn't deal only with sodomy. Because of what I said, they dealt with Jews, they dealt with homosexuals, and they also deal with bestiality at the same time. But there's no records of them ever being used. So the first laws are coming from the 16th century during the time of Henry VIII. Now, why were these laws passed in England? Well, these laws were passed in the first place in England, not as a way of power control on sexuality. I don't think that Henry VIII could actually, whoever knows that he had 8 wives, would actually think that he was actually keen on controlling people's sexuality when he could not control himself. But he was in a power struggle with the Roman Catholic Church. Why? Because Henry VIII needed the consent of the Vatican to divorce his first wife, a consent that the Pope, Clement of the time, was not prepared to give to him. And so in order to put pressure on the church, he said, how can we deal with the church in order to force, well, let's expropriate all their assets, the monasteries. This was the first thing that Henry VIII did, expropriation of the assets of the monastery of the Roman Catholic Church in England. In order to achieve that, they passed the sodomy laws, the consequence of which was that if people were found guilty of sodomy laws, then the first consequence, apart from death, was that all assets were expropriated. So they used those laws to expropriate assets of the monasteries in order to put pressure on the Vatican. The struggle with the Vatican and the reason for the law becomes even more evident because when Mary comes to power after the death of Henry, and the son that reigned for a few months only, but then Mary comes to power, Mary the Catholic, she actually repealed all those laws, right? Because their purpose was not sexuality. The purpose was purely to attack the Roman Catholic Church. So Mary repealed all those laws. And not surprisingly, after Mary's death, that Elizabeth I, the Protestant queen, comes to power, she reinstated all those laws. And there's very few records of those laws ever being used during the reign of Elizabeth by prosecuting people in the courts for sodomy. It's just that it's going to be little by little become part of the law of the land, and then as the empire grew, they started to spread those laws, because that was the way in which the English Empire or the British Empire worked, spread all those laws into the colonies. I think that just to finish and to wrap up here, sodomy laws is the best example of colonialism that we can see anywhere. There can possibly be a better example of a conquering that not even the Spanish did when they actually conquered the Americas, of a conquering power moving into a new society and bringing their own historical and political background into the colonies they were actually creating and dominating. Sodomy is the best example of that. And there has been an interesting research being done, and with this I'm going to finish, by Cambridge researchers published a couple of years ago, where it shows that of all countries where sodomy laws still exist, of which there are 76 countries in the world, most of those countries have received those laws by influence from the British Empire. Paradoxically, when you're dealing with those countries and informing this, they just basically don't want to accept this. And they actually claim, and this is again linking me to the discussion we had before, that this is a new type of Western neocolonialism that they're trying to take away something that is cultural of their society, without understanding very little that these sodomy laws actually are the most disgusting and most clear example of colonialism by a European power in the 17th and 18th century. I'm living here